there has been a war on our culture for the best part of 50 years. I mean, the long march of the left through the institutions is essentially a war against Anglo-Celtic culture. There was, I suppose, a political and ultimately an intellectual cowardice behind the whole thing. And as I said, we let ourselves down, we let the country down, and this all results in ongoing long-term damage. But in the end, we've got to be one country, we've got to be one people, we've got to be coming together constantly, and frankly, we should be stressing our unity far more, and any diversity that we might have far less. Let's face it, our migrants didn't come here because they wanted to lead exactly the same life as they led back home. They came here because they wanted a better life. And I used to say that as Liberals, we support smaller government, lower taxes, greater freedom. As Conservatives, we support the family, small business, institutions and values that have stood the test of time. But above all else, as patriots, we think this is the best country in the world to live. We want to keep it that way.
That it assumes that all cultures are equal. Mm-hmm. All cultures are not equal.
Correct.
Correct. Go and have a look at the trouble spots in the world and ask yourself about some of the cultures that we so freely, on the one hand, condemn, and on the other hand, then we want to argue, oh no, there's nothing superior about our culture. Yes, there is.
Of course there is.
There absolutely is. There's much that's worth defending, much that's worth fighting for. Well, Tony, good to have the opportunity just to talk about a staggering election outcome last Saturday as we speak. It's Tuesday the following week. It obviously has massive ramifications for Australia, just as it has huge ramifications for your party, the Liberal Party. I'm aligned in a sense as a coalitionist from the National Party by background. Let's just start with knocking one furphy on the head though. This election was not unwinnable. It's only a matter of weeks ago the polls were clearly indicating that the Australian people did not believe that the Albanese government deserved a second term, that there was a real pathway to government for the coalition. So as people gaze into the tea leaves and say, oh, it was years coming, or you didn't get this group, or you didn't get that group, we were fully competitive as a coalition just weeks ago, and yet we've gone down in one of the greatest drubbings of all times. What are the first lessons we can learn out of that?
Can I preface what I'm about to say, John, by urging people who are normally supporters of the Liberal Party or the National Party not to lose heart? Things can change very quickly in public life, and we only have to think back to the Voice campaign scarcely 18 months back, when it was Anthony Albanese and the Labor Party that were regarded as having failed monumentally and shown themselves to be monumentally out of touch. You might remember back in 2004, John Howard won 87 seats on the strength of something like 46% of the primary vote. People thought Labor were out of power for a generation, and within 3 years they were back. So I do want to preface what I'm about to say by encouraging people to be of good heart, even in this rather dispiriting time. You're absolutely right. This election was so winnable. At Christmas time, people had concluded that the government didn't deserve to be re-elected. We were ahead in just about all of the polls. What happened was that we failed to make a sustained case against the government, and in the end, the more they saw of us, the more they concluded that we weren't ourselves ready to govern. There are two questions that I think people ask going into an election. The first is, does the government deserve to be re-elected? And if the answer is no, they then ask a second question, is the opposition ready to govern? At the end of last year, they had well and truly marked down the government, but then we weren't able to persuade them that we were ready, and the longer the terrible campaign lasted, the more unready we seemed. And I can go into it if you like, but I mean, there was that thought bubble policy to get the public service back into the office. The Labor Party successfully portrayed that as an attack on everyone working from home, and so we reversed it. We said we were going to have a policy on revising the curriculum to make it about education, not indoctrination. In the end, we didn't do it. We never had an immigration policy, even though we'd frequently said that we thought immigration should be cut. In the end, we didn't even have a comprehensive energy policy. We announced a gas reservation before we had the modelling to show what the impact on prices might be. So while I have enormous respect for Peter Dutton as a human being, and while you've got to give him credit for getting us into a remarkably competitive position a few months ago, we completely blew it. We let ourselves down, but even worse, we let the country down. And that's to our shame, and it's obviously to, I guess, it's to the damage of our country.
Let's then just shape up why the Australian people were not convinced that the Albanese government should be returned. We've got to remember that if you take into account the fact that a lot of people didn't vote at all, fewer than 1 Australian out of 3 voted for this government. For good reason. We have the fastest collapsing living standards in the OECD. The OECD is the rich man's club, 35 countries. Australia's one of them. We're the 11th or 12th.
2 years in succession of declining GDP per head, an out-of-control immigration program, a society that's becoming more fractured.
A genuine cost of living crisis. Genuine. It's not made up. It's very real. We know from the research now that the more renewables in the system, the greater the impact, the reduction in our wealth. That's a fact. It hasn't proven to be cheaper. The more renewables we've put into the system, the graphs are there, the higher electricity prices have been, and that alone is a large part of the cost of living. Wasn't drawn out, but it is. We have declining productivity. Most other countries, even countries like ours that are in a bit of economic trouble, have improving productivity. We have stubbornly high inflation because the government is spending more of our money than ever. Our tax system is the most dependent on personal taxation of any country in the world except for Denmark. This is an almighty mess internally. Externally, we're now back to the horrendous model of great power competition that plunged the world into darkness at the beginning of the 20th century. And we're sitting here like sitting ducks, in contrast to our forebears who, when they saw a challenge, stepped up. No wonder many Australians are feeling pretty bad about their country, let alone the government, Tony.
I think the only people who feel good about the country right now are the Labor Party and its activists, because they are vastly relieved at having won an election that they should have lost. But you're right, economically we're in decline. Socially, we're more divided than we've been for years, and strategically, we're in dire peril, but we're largely oblivious to it, and we're certainly not doing anything to recover from it. Both sides comprehensively failed in this election to analyse our national difficulties and propose feasible or even intellectually serious ways forward. None of us wanted to look at the consistent trend of overspending. None of us wanted to look at the reasons behind the productivity fall. While there was some debate about energy, no one wanted to look at the whole question of net zero and was it worth it. No one wanted to really look at the horror of a renewables rollout, which is devastating so much of our countryside. I mean, the idea that we should destroy so much of the planet in order supposedly to save the planet, I mean, it's bizarre, but nevertheless, that's the reality, as so many of your farming communities understand, John. So we weren't prepared to consider immigration. Sure, we love migrants. We are an immigrant country. That's part of what it means to be an Australian. But this idea that we can just endlessly ratchet up immigration, that anyone from anywhere at any time is somehow always going to be of benefit to our country. There was, I suppose, a political and ultimately an intellectual cowardice behind the whole thing. And as I said, we let ourselves down, we let the country down, and this all results in ongoing long-term damage.
I want to come back to immigration in a little while, because it's very, very important. But before we do, I just want to stay a bit high level for a moment. It is my profound view that leaders lead. They carve out ground in the areas that are seen to be important.
Yeah.
I think sometimes, I love history, and I'm a sixth generation Australian, so I've been here a long time, and my family has been enmeshed with the country for a long time. So I just make that point because I'm passionate about what we've achieved. We've made our mistakes, but we've achieved a great deal.
Yeah.
Now, our forebears set up a federal government for the main purpose being what? The security and safety of the Australian people.
Correct.
I would argue that the three greatest responsibilities of the Commonwealth Government, the three greatest, all of them needing urgent attention, all of them more important than little debates about whether we should move this way or that way on the political spectrum or have quotas here or whatever. It's about the issues. If you take defence, plainly we're back in the era of major power instability that our forebears faced when we were a young nation, and they stepped up to it at the time, secured the homeland during the First World War. We wouldn't have sent troops off to ANZAC if they hadn't been able to secure our homeland. We couldn't secure our homeland today. No way, militarily. But you add to that justice. Always important. If you want social harmony, you have to have justice. One illustration of the gross injustice we're engaging in at the moment is the intergenerational theft.
Correct.
We've set up an environment, a policy environment, which we didn't debate, whereby we can't live within our means, so we're borrowing from our children unborn as well as born, and what's more, we're having fewer of them. So the tax burden that the few children we're having will face will be grossly unfair. That's not good for social harmony. It's not good for the future of your nation. Your third responsibility is to run an economy that allows you to keep the people safe and living within their means. Those three broad headline issues, it was as though they didn't exist. And the minor debates about how we shuffle here, it was this, it was that, it was whatever, ignore the reality that this isn't a left versus right, in my view, progressive versus conservative.
Yeah.
This is what really now has to be addressed if Australia is to be a free and prosperous country in the future. It's as serious as that, isn't it?
Look, you're absolutely right, John. I mean, we need a plan for a stronger economy, we need a plan for a more cohesive society, and we need a plan for greater security. And we haven't got any of that. At the moment, the current government is engaging in various acts of economic vandalism, whether it's the energy policy train wreck based on renewables, whether it's the union attachments which are helping to damage productivity and make, I guess, creativity in the workplace harder, jeopardise investment, whether it's the environmental preoccupations that mean that the agricultural enterprises and resource projects that are at the heart of our long-term economic future are being jeopardised and in large measures stopped. The whole climate preoccupations which are saddling us with vastly more green tape. The Indigenous cultural issues which are now being exploited by those who don't like wealth. Certainly they don't like us being wealthy to jeopardise things. So look, at the economic situation is imperilled. Our unity is fracturing. We are, in one sense, a multicultural society because we have people in this country who've come from many different countries and cultures. But in the end, we've got to be one country, we've got to be one people, We've got to be coming together constantly, and frankly, we should be stressing our unity far more, and any diversity that we might have far less. Let's face it, our migrants didn't come here because they wanted to lead exactly the same life as they led back home. They came here because they wanted a better life. And I think this gives us not just a right, but indeed a duty to do what we can to preserve the largely Anglo-Celtic culture, which has been our great strength, and to preserve the fundamental Judeo-Christian ethos, which has been at the heart of our virtue and decency as a society and as a culture. So that's imperiled. And then, of course, as you so rightly say, I mean, back in the early years of federation, with bipartisan support, a system of compulsory universal military training was introduced for all young men. It wasn't especially systematically enforced, but it certainly was a way of reminding everyone that they had to give back to their country. I suppose in those days, more of us were able to ride a horse and fire a gun than is currently the case. More of us lived the resourceful, outdoors, rather tough life that from time to time soldiers have to lead, but we were vastly better prepared. We had, thanks to Deakin and Fisher, we had a powerful squadron of the Royal Australian Navy that was admittedly at the disposition of the Admiralty when war broke out, but nevertheless HMAS Australia was one of the most powerful ships afloat back then. So we had 2 submarines at a time when almost no one had submarines.
Just stop and think about the significance of that for a while. We were just a little country of 5.5 million. We were only 7 years old when Deakin and Fisher jointly determined that we needed to go down that road. That fleet, as you say, with submarines, there were 2, but there were meant to be 6, just that they weren't able to be built before the war broke out. That was Australia on a bipartisan basis, not being left or right, not talking about do we only need to argue about quotas or about where we position. It was saying the world is becoming a dangerous place because of superpower competition. It's unstable. We need to be able to secure our homeland. 1 million people lined the foreshores of Sydney Harbour when that
to welcome the fleet into the harbour, correct.
And a year later, people forget this, it secured the Southwest Pacific, our home, from the Germans, who had a massive naval presence and other presence in the Pacific. We celebrate Anzac Day, we forget it was only possible because we'd secured our homeland. We don't even talk about securing our homeland today.
No.
I'm a farmer, as you know, always interested in agricultural issues. Why are we not up in arms about the fact that governments have not stockpiled anything like enough fuel, fertiliser, which we insist on bringing in from offshore, even though we should be making it here? That's just one aspect of security.
We don't even have a plan. I mean, once upon a time we had a war book that was as late as the 1960s. We had a war book, so Mike Pizzullo reminds us, which was regularly updated, basically talking about what would the country need to do, and what does the country need to do now, and what might it have to do down the track in the event of a very serious military threat requiring some kind of a mobilisation. We certainly need to be thinking much longer and harder about what are our military requirements, what are our civil defence requirements, what are our continuation of society requirements in terms of the sorts of things that we have to be able to make here, the sorts of things that we need to stockpile here, the sorts of things that we are prepared to rely on our friends for, the sorts of things that we are prepared to just find as best we can from the wider world. I mean, these are all the vital pieces of analyses which a serious country would be engaged in right now, but even to talk about them would be regarded as great political folly, because these are perils which I think the general view would be become more likely if they're talked about. So instead we take the ostrich approach, which is just stick their head in the sand and hope that the danger goes away.
Isn't there a lesson in the voice though? And in fact, more broadly, can I ask you as a Liberal, the Nats didn't do so badly. And it's worth remembering they took the first lead on the voice and on energy. And they didn't do too badly.
Correct.
Those are two issues where there are plenty of people now wanting to say, oh, you've got to move away from those, your positions on those sorts of things. I suggest, I don't want to put words in your mouth, there is a reward for actually breaking the ground and naming the things that people know are a real challenge, but no one did it during this campaign.
So look, John, you're right. The National Party did relatively well. It held all its seats, might have gained a seat. So good on the National Party. And I think that's because most people feel that the National Party has a stronger identity than the Liberal Party, which often seems to be all things to everyone. Sometimes it tries to be all things to everyone, which is no good. I mean, we need to reaffirm what are our core instincts and tendencies, if you like, and Howard often used to say that the Liberal Party is the custodian, as you'd remember, in this country of the liberal instinct of J.S. Mill and the conservative tradition of Edmund Burke. He used to say that at our best we're socially conservative and economically liberal. I suppose I had a slightly different take on it. I used to say that as Liberals we support smaller government, lower taxes, greater freedom. As Conservatives we support the family, small business, institutions and values that have stood the test of time. But above all else, as patriots, we think this is the best country in the world to live and we want to keep it that way. Our great equities, as far as the voter is concerned, have always been economic management and national security. And in this campaign, we jeopardised our reputation for economic management by proclaiming a cost of living crisis as the only thing that mattered, which invited both sides to then offer relief packages, and it tended to generate into a competition as to who could give the bigger handout, a competition which Labor was always going to win. And as for national security, well, we left it till well into the last fortnight of the campaign, after probably 1 million or 2 people had already voted, before announcing a defence policy, which was just a funding envelope without any significant content in terms of the kind of military forces that we would need now and into the future. So again, we badly let ourselves down. We failed to live up to our traditional strengths, and the public can sense when a political party is not being fair income. And it was as if we were saying to the people, look, you know that we're economically responsible, you know that we're strong on defence and national security, but we don't want to talk about that because what we're really trying to do is buy the votes of people who don't think and who will just go for whoever's going to offer them the next handout. And as I said, that's no way to win an election, and it's no way to conduct a political party that's interested in leadership as opposed to followership.
I'm going to confess to being extremely angry about the defence policy, extremely angry. It was wrong at every point. It was far too late in the campaign. It was inadequate, didn't explain what it was. It made the fatal mistake that we're still all making of saying, oh, it's all about whether we spend 2.3 or 2.7 or 3. The absolute necessity now is to get the wise heads together in government and in the military and frankly in the private sector to say, what are the dangers we face and how do we prepare for them, and then how do we fund what is necessary to do the first thing that is the responsibility of the government, keep the people safe. This time round, they even had used as an excuse to be really critical of my own side of politics, that they'd had to leave it to see how much money was left. That's not how you prioritise the defence of your nation. The only thing you can say for them was that they took it a tad more seriously than the grossly irresponsible mob that are there now. Let me just reiterate that in the rescoping, in inverted commas, of defence capability to pay for AUKUS further down the road, they've stripped over 80 billion out of present and short-term capability. At the same time, as I say, we face the most dangerous times the nation has ever confronted.
Yeah.
The two are absolutely irreconcilable.
Yeah.
I regard it as grossly and seriously inadequate to say on the one hand that these are dangerous times and then preside over an actual decline in our capability as you and I sit here now. How can we claim to be leaders?
Well, again, John, it's a good point. I mean, but what I don't want to see, what I wouldn't want to see, is yet another white paper process that takes 12 months, 2 years.
Maybe the view is that if we produce enough white papers, it'll confound the enemy.
I think it ought to be possible to decide basically immediately what's needed. We need offensive and defensive missile systems, we need more ships, we need more planes, and we need more men. We're 5,000 below establishment in terms of the armed force numbers. We should go ahead not with one, but with 2 new squadrons of F-35s, and they should be the marinised versions that we can put on our so-called landing helicopter docks, make them aircraft carriers as opposed to simply amphibious ships. We've been talking about getting light frigates urgently for 18 months. We knocked out one of the 3 bidders. I believe it's a German bid and a Japanese bid left. Let's just go with the Japanese bid because we know the Japanese have got skin in the game in a way that the Germans don't. Make decisions, get things done. Let's not have the analysis paralysis.
See, that's not a left versus right issue.
No, the analysis paralysis that bedevils everything now, whether it's defence procurement, whether it's opening a new mine, whether it's building a new road, whether it's working out a new plan. Analysis paralysis is killing us, and we've just got to stop all of this. And further to what you just said, this obsession with the quantum of funding is so typical of a government that thinks that you can buy improvements as opposed to make a difference. And as I often used to say as a minister in the Howard government, it's easy to spend money, it's hard to make a difference. But in so many areas, whether it's health, whether it's education, whether it's defence, people think all that matters is the quantum of spending. No, it's the quantum of output. It's the difference you're making that counts. Now, we've spent gargantuan additional amounts on education, and frankly, we don't have better schools. Our academic results are going backwards, not forwards. Our kids' mental health is going backwards, not forwards. We've spent a lot more on health, and I think generally speaking, we have got better outcomes there. Although again, you've always got to be asking yourself, is this really making a difference, or is it simply adding to bureaucracy? Is it really outcome driven, or is it more performative in terms of being able to say to a critical public, oh look, we're spending this amount of money, or we're creating this and that new structure? Again, the only thing that matters in the end is what kind of a difference does it make? And you can have any number of public servants liaising, facilitating, coordinating. You can have any amount of money going out. But if it's not actually making a difference, I mean, Indigenous policy, to take another example, it's a sinkhole of money, but how much difference does it make? I mean, in the end, in Indigenous policy, if the kids don't go to school, if the adults don't go to work, if the communities aren't policed, nothing good will happen. If the kids don't
grow up in safety.
If the kids continue to live, if people continue to live in places where there is no economy, you can't have any decent community because we all know what happens, regardless of people's cultural or ethnic background. If people are sitting in communities, so-called community settlements, where people have got nothing to do, they get up to mischief. That's just human nature. Idle hands, as the Bible tells us.
I want to come back to immigration and education, but before I do, all of this begs a question of advocacy. You know, one of the things that I must say really distresses me about many of those who have followed us. I mean, I know we had our failings, and some of our listeners will be quick to point them out, Tony. And you and I, I hope, would be modest enough to say we didn't get everything right. But it does distress me when I hear them say, oh, there's no constituency for this. There's no desire for it in the community. As Peter Costello points out, there was no desire for us to cut excess spending, to get the books back into balance. When we'd done it, we were heroes because interest rates came down and real living standards started to rise, the economy started to improve. There was no constituency for taxation reform. In fact, we nearly lost the 1998 election promoting an unpopular tax at the time. Nobody suggested, we should roll it back, as the saying was then. It's never happened. 26 years, 27 years ago, since that major reform, you've got to go out and argue. And it worries me that there were many people helping prepare the arguments this time, especially on energy. You know, the arguments were there to point to the truth about renewables, that once you get above it's 35-40% renewables, it's almost impossible to stabilise the grid, that it is not cheaper, it's not been cheaper anywhere in the world. Nobody pointed out that over a 60-year life cycle, nuclear turns out to be considerably cheaper than renewables. The lies were all, what happened to advocacy? I don't think we won a single day during that campaign.
We didn't fight on anything. We were brave and correct in committing to nuclear power in our electricity system last year, but we weren't prepared to sustain the argument, and in the end our energy policy was basically a bit of this and a bit of that, but it wasn't a comprehensive, credible policy because, as you say, we weren't prepared to run the risk of upsetting people. We weren't prepared to take the argument to the people and sustain it. Yeah, in the end, political leadership is not about giving people what they want, it's about giving people what they need, and successful political leadership is persuading them that they actually want what's needed, that they are prepared to do the tough things as opposed to the easy things.
See, I think we won the 1998 election narrowly. People say, you know, you were badly damaged because you were promoting a new tax. I think the reality is people realise we had conviction, and that got us over the line.
And if we were prepared to, if we had been prepared to say, look, we will have these 7 nuclear power stations on the designated sites. That means that we don't need to crisscross the country with extra transmission lines. That means that even after coal-fired power transitions out, we will have the reliable power needed to keep the lights on and sustain our industries and a first world economy. The difficulty was we weren't prepared to talk about what happens in the next 10 years because it would take some considerable time to get nuclear power substantially into the system. Maybe not the decade that was routinely talked about, but 5 years I think would certainly have been required, even if we did it at express speed. But in the immediate term, we do have to keep coal-fired power in the system, and we shouldn't apologise for that. We do need to get gas out of the ground vastly more quickly. I mean the Narrabri gas field up in your neck of the woods, John, that's been mooted for well over a decade, and yet it's every time it looks like it's got permission, something else happens and it doesn't go ahead. Some new avenue of lawfare is raised against it. there should be, if renewables really are the cheapest form of power, they shouldn't be subsidised. So why do we continue these subsidies, which just distort the system and make the economics of reliable power almost impossible? So we consistently ran away from all these hard issues.
So let's come to immigration. It's a very interesting one. I'm a believer in a moderately healthy-sized Australia, I have to say. And I also recognise that we just have to...
But as Paul Keating once said, John, the best immigrants are your own children.
Well, I recognise, though, and there's a bunch of issues in this as well, that Australians are not having kids anymore.
That's right, yeah.
And that's a subject that needs to be addressed. Actually, one subset of it is the price of housing. We know that problems of accessing housing are delaying family formations. One of many factors, but it is. But let's come to immigration more broadly. And young people. Let's switch to young Australians. They're the future. You know, we've had our go in many ways, and I am a firm believer that people who have lived a lot of life can be helpful counsellors and even agent provocateurs to their successors. So that's what we're trying to do. But we're trying to be helpful. We actually care about the country.
We're the elders of our tribe. Yeah. I think we deserve to be acknowledged and respected.
Well, let's at least prompt a bit of thinking. How about that?
Yeah.
So we are an immigrant nation. It's quite astonishing. Yeah. I think the immigrant population of America is around 15%.
Correct.
Britain is around 15%.
We're 30%.
We're around 30%. Over 30, actually. And then there's another 20%. You might fall into this category yourself, where one parent at least was not born in Australia. Now, let me put a twist on this first, and then we'll come to some of the economic issues around it. I was talking to a great Australian yesterday who gave up being a motor mechanic to go and train people in Asia in English as a second language. Right. And he came to me because he said, we need a program. I keep running into immigrants in Australia who say, I want to understand Australia. I want to be an Australian. I want to know what makes a place tick, why it's a better place than the one I came from. But he said it's nearly impossible for them now to gain access to any reliable information. And he said the schools are even worse. He said their kids go to school where they're basically told, they're taught Aboriginal history, but they're not told anything about how we became a democracy, how we became the country that we are today. We need to do something to help them actually understand what it is so that they can support it. But it raises this question as, you know, do you lose a certain sort of understanding of what it is to be Australian? You and I believe in the nation state, I think, as a logical basis for a coherent, free, prosperous society built on an engaged and vibrant citizenry. We're losing all of that. We're losing our commitment to it.
If you don't...
How do we make sure that we manage an immigration program that doesn't make it even harder to develop a sense of unity?
Well, the interesting thing is that when you actually speak to migrants, and if you use Ubers and taxis, it's impossible not to speak to migrants, regardless of your own immediate circle.
Or buy fuel, I might add.
Yes, they're very happy to be here in Australia. They love being in Australia, and as far as they can, they just want to fit in. Now, their leaders aren't necessarily of that disposition, because a lot of so-called community leaders basically want to turn migrant groups, particularly recent migrant groups, into victims, because that helps them, perhaps. But essentially, every migrant who comes to this country is voting with his or her feet confidence in Australia. And so it should reassure us about the fundamental worth of our society. Yet instead, as you've just touched upon, John, our kids are constantly indoctrinated about Invasion Day. Our university students are constantly indoctrinated about the evils of the patriarchy and our environmental despoliation and so on. Sure, some things we've got wrong, no doubt about that. But fundamentally, what happened subsequent to the 26th of January 1788 was a very good thing. Let's face it, until very recently, the Torres Strait Islanders, maybe they still do, they used to call the coming of Christian civilization as the coming of the light. That's how they referred to it, as their leader said at the Constitutional Convention back in 1998, the coming of the light. That was what it was. And that was the moment when so much that is good, so much that Aboriginal people today enjoy, first came to this ancient continent. The rule of law, concepts of human rights, notions of equality, the idea that everyone had a duty to everyone else. These were all things that were completely foreign to ancient Australia. And sure, I guess the Aboriginal clans inevitably ceded sovereignty and much possession to the newcomers. But what happened was a vastly better society and a vastly better way of life for everyone, including the descendants of the original inhabitants. And look, John, I mean, I think we should cherish the fact that we were settled by Britain. We shouldn't be embarrassed about the fact that we were settled by Britain. By virtue of being settled by Britain, the country which has probably had more influence on the modern world than any other, we speak the world's common language. We share in the heritage, the mother of parliaments, the rule of law, the scientific revolution, the emancipation of minorities. All of these things began and flourished first in Britain. That's part of our heritage, and we should be proud of it. And regardless of the background of our migrants, regardless of what country they come from, their religion, their ethnicity, they should be encouraged to participate fully in that heritage, which has become their own heritage, because they need to join Team Australia rather than simply live in Hotel Australia.
Tony, there will be those, they're out there already, saying that for the coalition to be relevant in the future, it must embrace progressive values. Now, I don't want to say that all progressive values, by any means, should not be considered, discussed, that there's not room for them, that people shouldn't have freedom of choice. But the reality is that we have passed peak woke. So you've got to be careful about which side of history you're really on, to use that silly term that people talk about. But more than that, I think there are two great fundamental flaws in progressivism that people should take into account. And they arise out of what you've been saying, or I'm prompted by them out of that. The first is that much progressivism is, in fact, for want of a better term, chronologically snobbish. It believes that all wisdom resides in the current time. It doesn't. And we make a fatal flaw by not teaching our history properly, particularly, I would argue, the beliefs that drove the values that drove our culture, and the story of our heroes. When you talk heroes, you realise they were heroes about something. They confronted tough times, they displayed courage, resilience, nobility of spirit. We don't teach our young people those things. So the chronological snobbery is a real problem. It's very limiting. It denies people, particularly young people, a sense of place and time and purpose, a grounding. The other great problem with it is that it assumes that all cultures are equal. All cultures are not equal.
Correct.
Go and have a look at the trouble spots in the world and ask yourself about some of the cultures that we so freely, on the one hand, condemn, and on the other hand, then we want to argue, oh no, there's nothing superior about our culture. Yes, there is.
Of course there is.
There absolutely is. There's much that's worth defending, much that's worth fighting for.
Look,
and the other fine point I make is it's been a failure. Progressivism is not succeeding. We're more divided, we're poorer, we're more challenged, we're less just as societies, and our young people are really not doing very well.
No, exactly right. And look, John...
some are, but...
I think it was John Howard who said that a conservative is someone who doesn't think he's morally superior to his grandfather.
Yeah, well, makes the point in another way.
And I think it was, I can't remember whether it was Aquinas or Newton who said that if we see far, it's because we stand on the shoulders of giants.
And we do in this country.
We do.
But we're not seeing very far.
We're not seeing very far, and we don't acknowledge the giants on whose shoulders we stand. And the task of each generation is to respectfully build on its heritage.
Yep.
It doesn't mean that the heritage can't be revised, reconsidered, modified, but it should be a respectful process, because we are who we are because of all of those who've gone before us. We know ourselves that all our yesterdays shape today and help to influence tomorrow. And this is where those who lived before have made an incredible contribution to those who live today, and indeed to those who live tomorrow. And Burke's famous phrase, society is a trust between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are yet to be born. I mean, we need to remember all of that, and we need to take it seriously. And it starts by rediscovering our history, yes, our history in this country, but also our prehistory in Britain, in Rome, in Greece, in the Holy Land, because all of that has made an extraordinary contribution to what we have here in this country today, and that should be cherished.
Young people, when I said they're not doing well, that was not I'm not trying to condemn. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to be sympathetic. Mm-hmm. I mean, we know now, for example, the damage that screens have done. 40% of our young people now reporting, in common with every other Western country, mental unwellness and anxiety, depression, medication, all running at very, very high levels. But let's come back, you touched on it, education. The numbers are always fascinating, aren't they? I think the Americans, around 3% of kids are educated outside the public system. In Britain, it's around 10%. It's around 40% here. Parents are doing everything they can. Why? Well, because the raw numbers will tell you that the government schools are not doing as well. There's just no other way of putting it. The OECD, the Organisation for Well-to-Do Countries, has done a lot of work, longitudinal studies on educational outcomes. We spend considerably more than the average rich country does per child.
Yes.
That's the first reality.
Yes.
We are spending more.
Yes.
This is not a funding problem.
No, it's not.
We have amongst the worst childhood behaviour in the classroom in the world.
Yep.
And we have some of the poorest and rapidly declining outcomes. And whilst I'm having a go at the coalition, I think we're in New South Wales. I would have thought the education portfolio in New South Wales is one of the most important in the country.
Correct.
One of the most important portfolios, state or federal anywhere, because it educates 40% of the kids in Australia.
It's the nearest thing to a universal experience that Australians have is going to a state school in a place like New South Wales.
And the standards are declining. In fact, some people would say New South Wales is leading the decline. And we had a long time to do something about it, and I'm afraid the raw numbers tell you can't get away from it. It's not very impressive. We're letting our kids down.
No, look, you're right, John.
And that's feeding. We're teaching them how to criticise, but not how to think critically.
Yep, and again, it's not hard to know what should be done. We need a stronger academic curriculum. We need better quality teachers. We need far more parental involvement in schools, regardless of their type, and we need more principal autonomy so that schools are not as subject to bureaucratic diktat as they currently are. But again, for as long as I can remember, the whole public policy debate about education has been conducted wholly and solely in terms of the quantum of funding and class sizes. Now, you can have a very small class, but if you've got a hopeless teacher, the kids won't learn. You can spend all the money in the world, but if the teachers are poor and the curriculum is rubbish, the kids won't learn. And if you don't emerge from your education as a reasonably capable, reasonably aware, reasonably curious person, then you're prone not just to economic failure, but to all the social and ultimately mental failures that so many people are subject to today.
You know, I reckon even though school education is essentially a state responsibility, and I don't want to have a go at teachers. I mean, we know they're deeply depressed, just absolutely overburdened at the moment. They're not given the tools they need to do the job properly. So, by and large, I have to say this: I have a lot of teachers in my own family. They need support rather than condemnation.
Correct.
But I would proffer that if the coalition had come forward with a really solid education platform and maybe run some rallies around the country for concerned parents, because we know from the research that's the point about them wanting, they'll pay almost any price they can, many of them, to get out of the state system. They want more say and they want a better education. They want their kids equipped to think, not to be told what to think.
Correct.
I reckon that in itself could have tipped the scales.
And look, whenever Peter ventured into the so-called cultural areas, sure, he was attacked uphill and down dale by the left that support the cultural dissolution that's going on. But whenever Peter ventured into this field, when he said there'd be one flag, not three, when he said that we needed education, not indoctrination, when he said that he found all these welcomes to country and acknowledgements of country overdone, I think there was a surge of support for him. But he generally, having raised the topic, then didn't prosecute it. And again, if you want to be a leader, it's one thing to state a position, raise a concern, but over time you've got to come up with a way forward, and we just didn't do that.
You know, when you think of culture wars, and I hear, that now there's an argument going on, should we have questioned welcome to country? Should we be co-flying the Aboriginal flag? Why does the coalition start culture wars? Well, the first comment I would make would be, well, if you want a real culture war, let's have it over what we're teaching our children, because that matters to parents, that matters to voters. That's real Middle Australia, and we know no one's satisfied. So let's go to places of real advantage. But who's really? They accuse us of starting a culture war. I don't think we started the war on our culture.
John, there has been a war on our culture for the best part of 50 years. I mean, the long march of the left through the institutions is essentially a war against Anglo-Celtic culture.
That was their term, by the way.
And the Judeo-Christian ethic. And we need to resist the attack on our culture, just as Indigenous people are praised if they want to protect and preserve what they see as their culture. If it's right for that, it's surely right for people like ourselves to protect and preserve the Australian version of English-speaking civilization. In turn, I would argue, perhaps the finest flowering of Western civilization more generally. Of course we have to protect and preserve it. We're crazy if we don't. It's our patrimony, it's our heritage, it's us. We have to defend it and assert it.
And I think the latent desire to do so is still there. Look at the crowds that turn out on Anzac Day.
Absolutely right.
But what would the Anzacs think of us?
Well, they would, I think, shake their head in bewilderment at things like gender fluidity, cultural self-loathing, magic pudding economics, the virus hysteria that we lived through for 2 years. I mean, I think so many of our forebears, the climate cult, I think so many of our forebears would wonder what madness had taken over.
Well, I think the greatest thing that would strike them, they'd say, well, we risked our lives and limbs and 2,000 of us died in the First World War, 39,000 in the Second World War, so that you could be free. And now you won't muscle up to the internal challenges or the external challenges. We do stand on the shoulders of giants.
Absolutely. And look, freedom should be an opportunity to be our best selves, not an opportunity to be weak and self-indulgent.
One last question, then we'll come to reasons for hope. I am really concerned at the explosion in government expenditure. It is truly staggering. It's unjust because we're spending our children's money.
Yeah.
And we will be crimping their lifestyles. We're worried about ours, understandably, because we're making a mess of economic policy. But it's showing up in all sorts of ways. One that staggers me is that in a very tight job market, 82% of employment during the years of the Albanese government of new employment has been in the public sector.
The so-called care economy.
Which does not,
Subsidised
yes, but
jobs.
it's not an economy.
It's not, no.
It's important, nobody argues that, but the wealth for it has to be generated by the private sector.
Correct.
And those numbers tell you the private sector is not doing well. The settings we have in place tell an overwhelming story that our trajectory is to much lower living standards in the future. That's the blunt reality.
And again, this is why the recent campaign and its outcome is such a disappointment, because while we did occasionally acknowledge that you can't subsidise your way to success, you can't tax your way to prosperity, that in the end the foundation of wealth is not government activity but private business activity, we didn't prosecute the argument and we didn't have the policy to make all those things come right. And that's why there is such a challenge ahead. But as I tried to suggest earlier, A, we can succeed, B, we must succeed, and if enough of us have a go, we will succeed.
The Liberal Party can rebuild itself quickly, do you think?
The Liberal Party has gone through many periods of waxing and waning. A catastrophic defeat. We secured only 32% as a coalition of primary votes. But we have come back from equally bad periods before. I think it was the 1978 election in New South Wales when we had 35% as a coalition, and the Labor Party, I think, had something like 60% of primary votes. So we can come back, but it is going to take a lot of effort by people of conviction and courage over the next few years.
Well, my plea would be that we don't get lost in debates about conservatives versus progressives and all of that sort of stuff. We actually focus on what needs to be done to secure the nation's future. Because I meet people on both sides of the left-right divide, reasonable centrist people, but either side of that divide, who recognise the nation actually really faces serious issues. They were not discussed.
Yeah.
I believe that that is appalling.
Yeah.
They must be discussed, and that must be the focus. Not point scoring, not petty arguments
As I
about
understand
where you
it,
position yourself.
As I understand it, John, conservatism is essentially pragmatic. We see a problem, we try to solve it, or at least make it better. It's pragmatism based on values, and those values, I think, are all but universal, and they don't change from one generation to the next.
Thanks, Tony.
Thanks, John.